Weiß Bescheid. Intendo.
I started my professional activity as a neurologist trying to bring relief to my neurotic patients under the influence.
יש אומרים שהוא גאון שהקדים את זמנו בשנות אור, ויש אומרים שהוא נוכל ערמומי שהתהדר בנוצות לא. גבירותיי ורבותיי, קבלו אותו, זיגמונד פרויד.
Out of this grew a new science, psychoanalysis, a part of psychology, as a new method of treatment of the neurosis.
We are going to unhang Elga, sexual object of Freud, this splendid woman.
הורסיו קרדו הוא אמן ידוע והרפתקן בלתי נלאה. הוא מוכר בארגנטינה כמי שמאייר את מיטב העיתונים והמגזינים. בואנוס איירס, עיר מגוריו, היא הבירה העולמית במספר המטפלים והמטופלים בפסיכואנליזה פרוידיאנית. כאשר הוא פרסם ספר והציג תערוכה נגד פרויד ומשנתו, זה לא היה מפתיע שגינו אותו מכל עבר.
Here to be against Freud is to be against culture. Even if you read the book that the visitors wrote, you are going to see that they're calling me barbarian.
מישל אונפרה כתב 55 ספרי הגות ופילוסופיה. הוא מוכר למיליוני צופי טלוויזיה בצרפת כמי ששוחט פרות קדושות, וזה בדיוק מה שהוא עושה לפרויד בספר הזה. פריז היא העיר השנייה בעולם במספר המטפלים והמטופלים בפסיכואנליזה פרוידיאנית, אז זה לא היה מפתיע שגם אותו גינו מכל עבר.
Ce qui m'intéresse dans l'aventure, c'est le personnage de Freud, les mensonges de Freud, les approximations de Freud, les affabulations freudiennes.
הם באים מהאקדמיה ומתחומי ידע מגוונים. היסטוריה, פילוסופיה, פסיכולוגיה, חינוך, תקשורת, סוציולוגיה, מדעי המוח ואומנות. מה שמאחד אותם זה שהם כולם מומחים לפרויד.
Freud has been dead for quite a long time, and he's treated by his critics in particular as more alive than dead. And I wanted to enter into the spirit of this debate about Freud by bringing Freud back from the dead. And so I wrote up an interview with Freud, which was situated in this room in London, in Hampstead, and he gave me some very interesting responses.
I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious.
The unconscious. It's a very radical idea when it appeared, the idea that you don't know yourself.
השוו אותו לקופרניקוס ולדרווין. על קופרניקוס נאמר שהוא הראה לאנושות שהיא לא במרכז היקום, לא השמש סובבת סביב כדור הארץ, אלא כדור הארץ עם כל הצניעות סביבה. דרווין הראה שהאדם הוא לא נזר הבריאה, המוצא שלו הוא מאיזשהו אב קדום קופי. פרויד הראה שהאדם הוא לא אדון אפילו בביתו שלו. כלומר שיצרים ודחפים מפעילים אותנו באופן שהוא בלתי מודע.
אני מטפל בכמה פוליטיקאים שהם ברמה גבוהה. אתה לא מתאר לך כמה כל מיני מניעים פנימיים שלהם מביאים אותם להיות בעד או בנגד כל מיני חוקים שהם צריכים להצביע עליהם בחיים.
Freud shows that without an understanding of the unconscious, without being able to work with the unconscious, we are trapped by it.
And then after you got wounded, what happened?
These airplanes,
Freud le aportó a la psiquiatría el contenido humanístico. La psiquiatría, hasta Freud, era una psiquiatría descriptiva. Digamos, esta persona tiene delirio, tiene alucinaciones, es esquizofrénica. Esta persona está deprimida, no se puede levantar, está triste, es una de maníaco depresivo. Freud se preocupó de explicar que si una persona dice que es Napoleón, o si una persona se cree que es Jesucristo, por algo hacía esa construcción.
And we understood something that we didn't understand before, in the same way that Darwin understood how species could come into being without having to attribute it to any kind of supernatural force.
Il dit qu'il a supprimé des névroses, des psychoses, des paranoïas, des schizophrénies, etc. Le président Schreiber, le cas de Anna O, l'homme au loup, l'homme au rat, etc. Et il nous dit, je les ai soignés, je les ai guéris, la psychanalyse, ça marche. Quand on travaille sur ces cas-là, on s'aperçoit que ce sont des cas construits, inventés. Si on prend le cas, par exemple, de l'homme au loup, on s'aperçoit que cet homme n'a jamais été guéri. Que quand il a passé 80 ans, il est toujours en analyse. Il s'est confessé dans les années 70 à un journaliste et qu'il a expliqué qu'il souffrait toujours autant. Freud est devenu vieux, célèbre sur la planète entière et qu'il est parvenu à réaliser son désir. Il écrit dans Analyse avec fin et Analyse sans fin, l'un de ses derniers textes, que la psychanalyse, ça ne marche pas.
פרויד כותב שהוא לא יכול להבטיח לאנשים אושר, הוא יכול מקסימום לגרום לכך שהאי נחת שלנו לא יהיה חולני.
פרויד אומר, הנפש היא מורכבת מכמה רשויות, וכל אחד מהפקולטות האלה של הנפש יש אג'נדה משלו, הוא פשוט מתנגש בשניים האחרים כדי להשיג את מה שהוא רוצה. העיד את הצרכים הכי מיידיים, תינוקיים, יצריים שאפשר לדמיין, הסופר אגו, האני העליון, את הצרכים של התרבות, את המוסר, את אידיאל העצמי, והאגו, משרתם של שני אדונים, צריך לספק גם את הצרכים של העיד וגם את הצרכים של הסופר אגו, כמו אדם שצריך לפצות את הצרכים של שני אנשים מטורפים לחלוטין שירדו מהפסים, חייב לעשות את זה בהצלחה כדי להציל את עצמו.
אושר מניח איזושהי שלמות, מניח בעצם סיום לקרע הפנימי שלנו, למתחים הפנימיים שלנו, מניח שאנחנו בסופו של דבר יכולים ליישב את כל הרצונות שלנו. הנחת היסוד של פרויד שאנחנו לא יכולים.
כי האדם מסוכסך באופן מבני. העובדה שיש כמה רשויות שפועלות בו זמנית, המשמעות של זה היא שתמיד תהיה איזושהי אג'נדה שמתנגשת עם אג'נדה אחרת והיא מייצרת נוירוזה.
אנחנו מקסימום יכולים להכיר בקיום הסתירות הפנימיות.
It helped me, I think. I know that certain characteristics about me are different now than they were when I started analysis. I started when I was 22 and I'm 35. So I have age, that's something.
אבל הטיפול שפרויד הציע, שהוא מילים שמפרשות את החוויה הטראומטית, כן יכולות לתת לאדם איזושהי בריאות נפשית מסוימת, כזאת שהוא כן יכול לחיות איתה, וכן יכול ליצור איתה, וכן יכול לחיות בתוך קשרים אינטימיים באמצעותה ובעזרתה.
When I have sexual relations with someone, I can now think of that person.
Rather than
somebody else, which is an enormous step forward to me.
How many years did that take? Where did that come in, roughly?
That just came in last week.
Psicoanálisis fue creado y se puede considerar el juego más sofisticado del siglo XX, porque es un juego donde se despliega la fantasía, donde se despliega la angustia y donde se arma una escena del propio mundo interno para poder lograr que evolucione la mente, el crecimiento, los pensamientos.
If you ask somebody what a Freudian slip is, they're very likely to tell you something about how somebody meant to say one word and they said a scandalous word instead.
Hat's לי מאוד טעים גבעת פרויד.
תודה רבה. את יודעת, הסוד הוא להוסיף כמות זנזונת של... כמות קטנטונת של פלפל.
So Freud encourages people to find meaning in everything. Hidden, guilty meaning.
אמא, את יכולה בבקשה לגעת לי בבולבול? אני רוצה לרצוח את אבא. להעביר לי את הבורגול. אני רוצה למזוג לאבא.
It's like a play. You go there and you play with your associations, you play with words, and, what did you say? I said mother. Yes. And I wanted to say something else, and this and that. So it's like you are going to kindergarten to play with this man who is very nice, and he is listening to you all the hour that you paid.
Freud knows how to play the psychological Sherlock Holmes. But that's a kind of parlor game that people in the 20th century learned to play. And it's great fun.
Psychoanalysis is so popular because when you read a book, you see a film, whatever, you have all these people going around, but this story is all about you. You are the story, and you are all the actors of the story as well. It's fascinating. We are all narcissistic.
What was new with Freud, of course, is that sex and aggression are constant elements in the way we function. And that these are motives that are not conscious to us and nevertheless direct our behavior.
He will tell you quite candidly, this vision of the world that I have came from looking at myself. It came from self-analysis. I discovered in myself, in my own psychic life, this sexual desire for my mother and the corresponding hostility to my father as my rival. And it's only through the analysis of my own life that I have discovered these universal patterns.
He made sex and aggression not matters of epic drama, but of everyday individual drama. And that was a revelation that has not left us.
Freud a projeté son inconscient dans l'inconscient des autres, de laisser croire que parce que lui avait le désir de coucher avec sa mère, lui avait le désir d'en finir avec son père, tous les hommes avaient le désir de coucher avec leur mère et tous les hommes avaient le désir de tuer leur père.
Psychoanalysis is something like the system in which everything or the world goes around Freud's mother.
Freud nous dit c'est transmis de manière phylogénétique, ça se transmet sans atomes, ça se transmet sans particules, ça se transmet sans énergie, mais ça se transmet tout de même par une espèce de mécanique tout à fait magique. Et Freud passe de son fantasme à la vérité scientifique. On peut prouver la vérité de Copernic, on peut prouver la vérité de Darwin, on ne prouve pas la vérité de Freud. C'est une fiction totale qui a produit des effets extrêmement dangereux au point qu'aujourd'hui chacun pense que le complexe d'Oedipe est une vérité universelle.
People did not believe in my facts and thought my theories unsavory. The system was callous and unrelenting.
He used to call it resistance, and this has become a word of abuse. The Freudians, they always say any criticism of them, that's just resistance. People resisting their theories because they don't like their theories. So we don't have to take those objections or criticisms into account.
And as Freud's disciples started to gradually question some of his doctrines, he had a long famous sequence of what he called defections or heresies, people who didn't agree with him about important things, Adler, Jung, Rank, Ferenczi. He broke with all of them eventually.
Oui, c'est vrai, il voulait marquer sa marque, il voulait être le maître tout-puissant et qu'il n'était pas question que quelqu'un puisse lui faire de l'ombre, qu'il pouvait repousser quelqu'un qu'il avait adoré la veille.
He was an immensely authoritative, an immensely dictatorial at times person.
In terms of child development and our understanding of the power of early childhood, I think we have an enormous legacy of Freudian ideas.
Whole way of thinking about the interaction between parents and children and how parents need to listen to their children and how parents need to listen to themselves and be their own authorities, this comes from Dr. Spock. Dr. Spock was psychoanalytically trained. He studied Freud.
Freud had as one of his main objectives to get parents not to be so repressive with their children, not to be so repressive of masturbation, not to be so punitive around sexual ideas, sexual feelings. So You can see post-Freudian children are actually different than their 19th century predecessors.
Freud a été scandaleux. Il était scandaleux parce qu'il parlait de sexualité. Il parlait de l'importance de la sexualité dans la construction psychique des enfants et des futurs adultes. Et la place que le plaisir, le désir et surtout le refoulement de ce désir pouvait créer pour la société viennoise de la fin du 19e siècle et du début du 20e siècle, toutes ces questions étaient des questions taboues. Les enfants étaient des anges, la sexualité des adultes relevait de la chambre à coucher, point.
He was obsessed with sex. He was obsessed with his mother. He was obsessed with his daughter, Anna Freud. And his daughter was having some kind of, disturbing thing with her father.
My relationship with Anna was deeply sexual in the sense that we together explored her own libido and her fantasies in order that we could expunge them. And I think that my association with my daughter was an exploration of our therapy together.
So we don't know if she, I can't say it, I'm blushing, if she didn't masturbate with you in mind.
I think she probably did.
So, if you see the sickness that conceived psychoanalysis, you have to see how dangerous this could be.
What is the very worst that we think and feel? And what is the most taboo that we can feel? If we bring it into the light and we say, you want to masturbate thinking about your father, so let us talk about this. Bring it out into the light, it is no longer a monster. But never let this be taken beyond where it should be. And what you say, diddling her.
פרויד, ובגלל זה כולנו שונאים אותו, כל הזמן אומר לנו, תסתכלו שם, אל הלמטה, אל ההתחלות, אל הראשית, אל הביולוגיה, אל הפיזיות, אל הרטוב, אל המסריח, אל מה שבאמת משם צמחנו. גע בהוויה הכאוטית הזאת. אל תפחד, רד לרמה הקמאית, תתנסה בה, ואחר כך תצא משם ותהיה בן תרבות ותראה את מותר האדם שבך.
Freud, il a analysé sa propre sexualité. Il a exploré la relation avec l'homosexualité. L'histoire de la psychanalyse, c'est des histoires d'amour passionnel entre Freud et certains de ses disciples, comme Fliss par exemple, ou comme Jung, qui sont des histoires homosexuelles sublimées d'une certaine façon, et qui lui permettent aussi de forger certains outils sur l'homosexualité inconsciente.
The fact that there's this revolution in front of our eyes, a real revolution, a social revolution, about the acceptance of homosexuality as part of the normal way of functioning as an adult and growing up as a sexual person. This clearly, starts with Freud and founded in Freudian thinking.
Conchita Wurst, vainqueur de l'Eurovision. Pourquoi est-ce qu'il y a une telle fascination pour un personnage comme celui-ci qu'on aurait considéré comme un monstre il y a 20 ans?
She is a symbol of tolerance, freedom, a marvelous voice. I am in love with her.
Je rappelle que Freud critiquait l'homosexualité, en faisait une perversion, considérait que tout ce qui n'était pas génitalo-génital, je dirais, était une perversion.
When you look at Freud's 3 essays on sexuality, you can see there's a way to read it in which it's all very heteronormative, that it's men and women and heterosexuality, and that's the norm and everything else is perverse. Or you could see how fluid gender is and how fluid sexuality is, and that combinations of people who they desire, what they're like, what their gender is, are enormously fluid and flexible.
Freud, he wasn't a moralizer.
he listened to what his patients said and didn't offer a moral opinion. If you happened to be gay or lesbian or anything, wherever your desire took you as you lay on the couch and speaking it and freely associating, Freud did not think that was wrong. He was a scientist in that sense.
Anna était homosexuelle. Anna vivait avec une femme. Et elle vivait avec une femme et les enfants de cette femme. À Londres, dans le même immeuble où habitait Freud. On peut dire que Freud, il a hébergé chez lui la première famille homoparentale. C'est-à-dire qu'en même temps, il avait une ouverture d'esprit par rapport à ça qui était très remarquable pour son époque.
Freud pulls down the whole notion of respectability. Because underneath were all these bestial creatures, and our attempts to redirect our bestial energies towards higher things is a substitute and a disguise to a large degree. Many people have read Freud as emphasizing sexual repression, but when you look at his historical scheme, it's the repression of religion that is key.
Both the rabbis and the priests were busy suppressing sexuality. The body was evil. And the whole purpose of an individual who was religious in any way was to keep those sexual forces under control. Freud naturalized those forces. He said they were simply a part of what every human being is, and with that you had the shattering of Victorian sensibility, a widespread shattering that we haven't recovered from today, and probably will not.
Je dirais que l'individu de pré-freudien, c'est un individu soumis et qui gagne sa liberté dans un certain combat par rapport à cette soumission sociale. C'est un individu qui va lutter contre la monarchie, par exemple, qui va lutter contre une certaine forme de patriarcat, qui va lutter contre la religion. Alors, la psychanalyse, c'est on pourrait dire, une science de l'émancipation.
People should find their voice. This is the phrase. It sounds like it came from California. It didn't come from California, it came from Vienna. That people needed to find their inner voice and find their own truth and find their own way of thinking that sheds, that releases them from parentalized voices of authority of the past.
Freedom, 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 freedom.
And that's what Freud felt was the project of liberation of each individual.
Dans la Vulgate, on nous dit que Freud est un juif libéral, mais il n'est pas du tout libéral. Il souscrit à la totalité des régimes totalitaires de droite de son temps. Il n'y a pas une seule ligne écrite contre Adolf Hitler, pas une seule. Dans l'œuvre complète, il y a d'abondantes considérations contre Marx, contre le marxisme, contre l'Union soviétique, contre le bolchevisme.
There's an anecdote about Freud. After World War I, somebody was explaining to him the communist revolution, that first all the institutions, all the models, all the positions will be torn down and everything will be destroyed. And then we will build a perfectly just and harmonious society in which all people are equal and everyone gets what they deserve. And Freud said, I believe the first part.
He said they don't understand human nature. He said men will still be hateful. They will still be aggressive. They will still be lustful. And that's human nature. That cannot be fixed by some new social system or some economic system.
He was very conservative. Freud was not himself politically radical. And when you look at the European, there are plenty of people who want to combine psychoanalysis with political theory and political ideology. Not Freud.
Many of these movements Freud was very cautious about and careful about. For one thing, he was very concerned with protecting his psychoanalytic movement. And he understood that if he was too much on any side of any issue, that it could detract or get in the way or distract from his movement. His major concern was going to be protecting the movement.
But his ideas become revolutionary in political as well as in cultural and aesthetic in the course of the 20th century.
Polkli dice que el arte no reproduce lo visible, la función del arte, sino que hace visible lo que no se ve. Y en psicoanálisis buscamos lo mismo. Esa es nuestra búsqueda. Por eso para mí están profundamente interrelacionadas.
So artists begin to see themselves as, in a sense, Freudian beings, and unconscious motivations become a wellspring of creative activity, and psychoanalysis overlaps with literature and other arts right from the beginning.
One of the great 20th century art tendencies is surrealism. Surrealism was a crazy way of portraying the world in the early 20th century. It was inspired by Freud's notion of the unconscious. So it got us used to art that defies logic. And it's now everywhere, right?
I knew you would come. A taste of the extraordinary.
He gave a direction to 20th century art that it wouldn't have had otherwise.
Fashion designers such as Elsa Schiaparelli followed the surrealist idea that fashion shared with the arts a capacity for parody and play and jokes and desire, a game of illusion, but predominantly a game of meaning, disseminating signs and clues between people about wearing symbols.
There's a psychology of dress. Have you ever thought about it? How it can express your character? You all have interesting characters, but some of them are all hidden. Try and express yourselves better in your dress.
Le freudisme est rendu possible le surréalisme, et il est vrai qu'en France, Freud doit sa réputation aux surréalistes, à André Breton, aux freudo-marxistes.
Freud was horrified at the ideas that André Breton put forward, that he would think that you would go into the subconscious mind to find inspiration for poetry was ridiculous for Freud. The subconscious mind was something that needed to be teased up, coaxed to the surface, laid bare, and to be analyzed in the light of the medical gaze. It was not a place that you delved into for source material.
The surrealists were part of a political project that was also about imperialism, countering fascism, and they wanted to replace what they thought of as the great bourgeois ego with the id, the power of the unconscious, dreams, fantasy, rebellion. Unfortunately, Freud's own ambition was, as he put it, where id was, there ego shall be, and the surrealists' ambition was really the other way round.
This is a kind of paradox. Freud is a conservative revolutionary, someone who in many ways was not very interested in what he unleashed.
If you look at a film like Un chien andalou, the Louis Buñuel and Dali film, the focus on the attack on the clergyman, yes, is a standard communist idea or social idea or anti-clerical idea, but the way in which it's depicted is a purely irrational dream logic idea that was authorized and allowed because of Freud's dream book.
What Freud did that nobody had done before was to say the dream is replete with meaning.
I can't make out just what sort of a place it was.
Not within the context of some divine dispensation or some allegorical code book, but within the individual life of the dreamer.
Did you recognize this kissing bug? I'm afraid she looked a little like Constance.
This is plain, ordinary, wishful dreaming. Go on.
חלק מאוד משמעותי מחיי הנפש שלנו באים לידי ביטוי בלילה. כשאנחנו רדומים וישנים, יוצאים מהמחבוא שלהם כל השדים האפלים שקשורים ליצרים ולאיסורים של טאבו ולכל מיני תשוקות שאסור לנו לחשוב עליהם ביום-יום, וגם טראומות ופחדים. לפעול אומר שם, זוהי דרך המלך אל הנפש שלך, באמצעות החלימה.
After the war, there was a general interest in Central Europe in the effects of war on things like badness and violence. And the German expressionists was very interested in applying the psychoanalytic ideas to the craft of filmmaking. So you can think of Robert Wiener's film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, as a Freudian text. And all those who left Central Europe in the 1930s and set up in the Hollywood film industry a new genre of filmmaking, film noir, went on to popularize ideas of the detective thriller, of the melodrama, using popular culture as a way of thinking about psychological structures.
Is that you, Mr. Brown?
Take Hitchcock, for example, whose films are kind of often detective stories seeking to expose the unconscious motivations of the central characters.
I don't believe in dreams that Freud stuffs a lot of hooey.
Oh, you are a fine one to talk. You got amnesia and you got a guilt complex. And you don't know if you are coming or going from someplace. But Freud is hooey. This you know. A wise guy.
And you would find that the development of film in particular was affected by the idea that we are motivated by unconscious desires, fears, and anxieties.
I came here today to tell you, in all seriousness, that I'm done. I gave it a lot of thought, and I decided that once and for all, it's over. The truth is, this therapy is a jerk-off. You know it, and I know it.
So with that as a kind of cultural inheritance, you can see that virtually every character on the stage in realistic drama owes something to Freud.
I was recuperating in my childhood home, in my childhood bed, and I thought, well, let me read one of these childhood books that I never read when I was in college. And I had one of these books, Sigmund Freud, Jokes in Their Unconscious, and I began reading it, and I went, oh my goodness, it's the holy grail of comedy.
As Professor Sigmund Freud once said, laughing at people in pain is a manifestation of a deep-seated hostility.
This is really the first comprehensive approach to the study of jokes and humor more generally.
My makeup artist came to me and told me I just had the worst week of my life. When I read Freud's book, no one ever said it clearer or more succinctly that comedy is making the meaningful meaningless. And I say, I don't care if you are Sir fucking Laurence Olivier, I'm not gonna have you wanking off in my chair. And she pulled the blanket off and he was cleaning his glasses. And conversely, making the meaningless meaningful.
The value of jokes is based upon the cleverness with which they are able to combine not normally combined ideas in a surprising way.
As they might be in a dream, there's displacement. One idea is suddenly diverted to another idea that seems unrelated. Freud was a joke teller. He often used them as glosses, told to illuminate a point that he was making. When he wants to talk about egoism, he says,
Also, es ist wie die französischen Farmer, wo der Mann zu seiner Frau sagt, wenn einer von uns stirbt, dann kann ich nach Paris ziehen.
The joke was a way of evading a kind of social censorship. and repression that existed. And in fact, jokes were one way to get around that suppression.
Freud said the purpose of all comedy is human freedom.
Pam Anderson, wow. I'll never forget the first time I saw her asshole.
Which is interesting. A friend of mine, Sarah Silverman.
But enough about her asshole. Let's talk about...
The idea that she's this beautiful woman who...
Say her vagina.
...can say horrible things is an example of freedom, verbal freedom.
It's the only way you can tell a woman's true hair color. And lucky for you, I actually caught a glimpse of it backstage while she was changing. And her true hair color, bald.
So the joke's forms of social protest is a form of aggression. Someone is the victim of the joke.
I would like an honest equation from any, at least grammar school graduate.
You can't imagine Lenny Bruce in American culture without psychoanalysis.
Is the word son of a bitch less obscene to you than motherfucker? Really? Is it the fact that a Catholic president called all businessmen son of a bitches in a Jewish comic relates motherfucker?
He confronted American society at the time with all of its repressed desires in our face, all of our sexual fantasies.
If you're interested in the meaning of obscenity, I'm less obscene than the president. If the word motherfucker stimulates you sexually, you're in a lot of trouble. Especially if it's my mother.
He's a very Freudian comic. I don't think any stand-up comedy is without Freud.
The best protection against neurosis was religion. There are many cultures that have a shaman, a medicine man, a priest, a person that can come to you when you have a problem and call up all the emotions, all the devils, and purge them. And modern people are neurotic largely because they've given up religion. So Freud came along and he really reinvented that figure for modern culture. He said, well, I can do this, but I can do it on a scientific basis. And people want that. They're willing to be told that an authority figure of some kind can do something to them that will help.
Freud qui pense que Dieu est gênant parce qu'il prend toute la place et que lui, Freud, voudrait prendre la place de Dieu. Freud qui considère qu'il y a eu Moïse dans le temps et il y a Freud maintenant. Et que Moïse a rendu possible le judaïsme et que Freud rend possible la psychanalyse qui, elle, deviendra la grande religion du XXIe siècle et des siècles à venir, j'y vois moins un effet d'athéisme qu'un effet de mégalomanie.
Freud was a heroic figure. He heroized himself. He called himself a conquistador of the mind. He identified himself with all the great figures in history, Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon. He was extremely grandiose.
Il y a une affaire de projection et de subjectivité chez Freud qui en fait un grand poète, un grand littérateur, un grand lyrique, mais surtout pas un scientifique.
And you know, the one prize he won in his lifetime, the one important acknowledgement, was the Goethe Prize for literature, not the Nobel Prize for science.
Freud wrote about culture. For example, he wrote Totem and Taboo about religion. He wrote Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, which was about mob phenomena and how people come to follow certain leaders in political or religious movements. But as a doctor, most of his data comes from his patients.
Freud took very seriously the fact that his views were based upon evidence, so that his claim to be a scientist, to belong, with Darwin rather than with Shakespeare.
Freud eventually fell somewhere between medicine, theory, and philosophy.
La psychanalyse, c'est l'invention d'une trentaine d'individus assez géniaux, presque tous juifs et viennois, des gens extraordinaires. Freud, bien sûr, mais Jung, mais Adler, mais Breuer, mais Ferenczi, mais Wilhelm Reich. Celui qui se présente comme le père fondateur n'était pas le père fondateur. L'idée que l'inconscient, c'est le pilote qui conduit le cœur de l'homme, il faut juste dire que cette bonne idée de Freud, c'était une idée de Nietzsche. On croit aujourd'hui que Freud a découvert le mécanisme du lapsus. Sauf que Freud emprunte sa théorie du lapsus à un psychanalyste dont on a totalement oublié le nom, qui est Gross.
There were individuals, also geniuses, who did see, before Freud, what he did, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, but Freud was certainly the first person to use that, to harness it for actually helping relieve human suffering.
Freud's a borrower. He's a synthesizer of many other people's ideas. But the fact that Freud borrowed doesn't mean that he's wrong at all. Most great scientists are synthesizers, right? They have a long apprenticeship where they acquire the knowledge of the field and then they come up with one new thing.
Freud fut un grand chaman à Vienne qui a menti pour asseoir son pouvoir au début de son existence. Il est menti en exploitant la douleur et la souffrance et la misère morale des gens et qu'on peut faire commerce de ça et vivre très bien de la psychanalyse.
Psychoanalysis is money, you know, and they know that they can be telling a dramatic story, but when the time expires, it's finished, because another patient is coming.
You know, Woody Allen said, if you commit suicide, they make you pay for the sessions you've missed. You know, Woody Allen had a clear sense of his relationship with his psychoanalysts.
I always think that the doctor is listening to me, but not really caring. He's thinking about when he can get out on a sailboat and how fast the session's going to be over, and do I know a lot of good girls because I'm in show business, can I get him one? You know, that kind of thing. But no, I don't feel that there's any sense of real interest in my problems.
Can you talk about that with him and not offend him?
No, I try not to give him any accurate information about myself.
כשפרויד מגיע לארצות הברית בשנת 1909, בביקור הראשון והיחיד שלו ביבשת, כשהספינה שלו מגיעה לחופי ניו יורק, הוא אומר משפט לעמיתים שלו, יונג ופרנצי, הוא אומר, They do not realize that we are bringing them the plague. כמובן לא למגפה במובן של איזושהי מחלה שתכחיד את האמריקאים או משהו כזה, אלא במובן שעכשיו הוא הולך להביא איתו רעיונות ויראליים, רעיונות שהולכים להדביק את התודעה המערבית, את התודעה האמריקאית, שהם לא יוכלו להיפטר מזה. הוא צדק.
And here was this Jewish man from Austria coming to tell Americans how to heal themselves mentally and spiritually. And the grand climax, no doubt, was a lecture on human sexuality. And they translated this lecture into permission to have free love. So, we can think of the plague that Freud claimed that he had brought to America as the sexual revolution, in which the anti-authoritarianism, the desire to be free, independent individuals, came into fruition in the 1960s.
My baby does the hanky-panky. Physical desire is very normal and it happens, and sometimes everything just comes down to a very basic level and there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with just sex for sex.
Freud n'a jamais été un libérateur du sexe. Freud a toujours pensé qu'il fallait renoncer au sexe, renoncer à la sexualité pour sublimer des pulsions dans des effets de civilisation.
פרויד מניח הנחה שקיימת איזושהי אנרגיה נפשית. הוא קורא לה ליבידו. מבחינתו האנרגיה הזאת מאוד קשורה למיניות שלנו. ככל שהמיניות שלנו יותר באה לידי ביטוי, האנרגיה הזאת יותר יוצאת החוצה, יותר חופשית מממשת את עצמה. ככל שאנחנו יותר מדכאים את המיניות שלנו, גם האנרגיה הזאת יותר מרוסנת, ואנחנו מכוונים אותה למקומות אחרים, לעבודה, לאומנות, יצירות תרבותיות וכו'. זה בעצם היסוד של הסיסמה של שנות ה-60 של Make Love Not War.
Something happening here, and what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I've got to beware. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Come on, come on, come on, come on.
פרויד לא טען את זה. זה כבר היה הפשטה של העניין על ידי וילהלם רייך. ווילהלם רייך היה המנהל של הסמינר הקליני אצל פרויד. זאת אומרת, הוא פסיכואנליטיקן בכל דבר.
Would you
Yes, I think it is alive and doing well. Because we live in your time is modern with new ideas and equality. But you know, civilization is only skin deep and is quickly removed, as the Nazis proved so well. And behind that, the conscious civilized mind is the reptilian mind, the brain, the basic instincts. And when a little girl sees a naked little boy for the first time, she still to this day says, I want one of those, because he's got something she hasn't got.
The women's movement at first denounced Freud, see Freud as patriarchal and misogynistic, but they quickly, really in just a few years, come around to the idea that without Freud, they're never going to be able to study gender and sexuality, that they need Freudian ideas to study the very things that brought them to criticize him.
Women were denied a great many freedoms in Victorian society. They were denied the freedom of movement, of intellectual expression, because it wasn't considered feminine in the appropriate way. They were denied education up to a point, and virtue ruled supreme. And women were not supposed to have sexual thoughts, or indeed sexual feelings, or indeed desire. Now, what Freud did, as part of his clinical practice, he listened. And he listened to women quite a lot, as well as listening to men. And the kinds of things that he then began to think about, like sexuality, like repression, like the ability to freely associate and speak your thoughts and whatever came into your mind, were very, very important in allowing women to think about themselves and giving women an importance.
Which firmly and unmistakably underlines.
And that was Freud's great contribution to the freedom of women.
Everything that we know today in terms of consumerism is based upon Freud's ideas and Freudian theory. The main thing that we need to think of is desire.
I love shopping.
Desire, fortunately for those who produce consumer objects, is never satisfied. You always want something more, something else, the latest model, the next breakfast, the next puff of your cigarette. And this is what Edward L. Bernays understood from his uncle, Sigmund Freud. Edward L. Bernays, he is considered to be the founding father in America of what we call public relations, which is a very nice way of saying he taught Americans how to consume.
And in that sense, Freud's ideas have contributed to the overgrowth of consumerism in our lives.
Psychoanalysis, it can be used to manipulate people. It can certainly be part of marketing and political thinking.
U.S. Secretary of State Dulles takes the rostrum to urge united action by the Americas to outlaw international communist intervention in the Western Hemisphere.
לאחר מלחמת העולם השנייה, ארצות הברית נמצאת בחרדה מתוך החשש שתתחיל מלחמה עם ברית המועצות. ולתוך כל החלל הזה מגיעים הפסיכואנליסטים, והפסיכואנליסטים באים באמת מנסים לעזור בצורה כזאת שיביא אנשים להיות מוכנים להקריב אפילו את חייהם למען המלחמה הקרה, למען האומה האמריקאית. צריך להבין שעד אותו רגע האמונה באמריקה היא אמונה בסכלתנותו של בן אדם. כלומר, בסיסו של הרעיון הדמוקרטי היא שבני אדם מסוגלים לקבל החלטות מושכלות בצורה רציונלית על בסיס מידע, ואז מגיעים לרעיונות של פרויד בתיווך של אדוארד ברנייז, והופכים את העולם על פיו, ואומרים, אנשים הם בעצם לא שכלתניים, אנשים פועלים על פי דחפים. זה מה שמניע אותם, זה מה שגורם להם לקבלת החלטות.
My father understood about groups that you can tap into their deepest desires or their deepest fears and use that to your own purposes.
הרעיון של הפסיכואנליסטים זה לתפעל את האיד החייתי הזה, הכל כך בסיסי בנו, כדי לגרום לאינדוס של אדם חדש.
The image of the human being that was being built up at that particular time
was that there was a great deal of vulnerability in every human being, and that vulnerability could be manipulated to program somebody in such a way that they could be automatons, if you will, for whatever your own purposes were.
זאת התקופה שה-CIA יוצר תוכנית סודית שנקראת MK אולטרה. והתוכנית הזאת, שמתבססת על מחקרים וחוקרים באוניברסיטאות בכל רחבי ארצות הברית, שבהם פסיכולוגים אומרים, בואו ניקח את האנשים אחורה בזמן, באמצעות של כלים מאוד מדעיים, שחלקם נבראו על ידי פרויד. נמחק להם את הזיכרונות שעלולים לגרום להם להתניה כלשהי שלו למשהו שאנחנו רוצים, וניצור התניה מחודשת לדברים חדשים, כלומר נהנדס אותם מחדש. כל הדברים האלה נעשו בכל מיני אמצעים, ביניהם שוקים חשמליים, היעדר שינה ושימוש ב-LSD. אחד החוקרים המובילים במחקר הזה היה יואן קמרון. יואן קמרון היה ראש האגודה הפסיכיאטרית האמריקאית.
He thought that psychiatry should not just concentrate on sick people, mentally ill, but psychiatrists should be in every parliament and should direct and monitor political activities because they knew in a rational, scientific way what was good for people.
יועצי קמפיין ופוליטיקאים הבינו בשנות ה-60 וה-70 מה שפרויד הבין שניתן לטפל את הרגשות האלה במהלך קמפיינים.
ראש הממשלה.
קמפיין הבחירות של 2013 בישראל. אנשים באמת, כששאלו אותם בסקרים, על פי מה אתה הולך להצביע? רוב הציבור בישראל אמר מצוקת דיור, מצוקה כלכלית. בפועל קרה שהרבה מאוד אנשים בסופו של דבר הצביעו על משהו אחר, על איראן.
הזמנתם בייביסיטר? קיבלתם ביביסיטר. איפה הילדים?
אתה תשמור לנו על הילדים?
תראו, זה או אני.
בעצם אנחנו רואים תפעול של פחד, כלומר, מי שרוצה לשרוד ב-2016, 2017, 2018, רצוי שיצביע על בסיס סוגיה אחת, וזה האיום האיראני.
לבחירות הקרובות, אתם בוחרים מי ישמור על הילדים שלנו.
So, psychoanalysis is what we would call morally agnostic. It can be used for good, can be used for very dangerous. The same ideas can heal somebody and actually break their spirit.
Freud was quite intent on unmasking the secret, to reveal what is not transparent, is very much something that preoccupies us in our everyday social and political sphere today. We don't want our politicians to be living things that we don't know about. And that desire for openness, for a lack of secrecy, is, I think, part of the Freudian reflex.
במהלך מלחמת העולם השנייה, אלה היו ימי הפריחה של הפסיכואנליזה בפסיכיאטריה האמריקאית. היא כן סיפקה מודלים להבנת, למשל, הלם קרב, אבל החל משנות ה-50, שהמגמות בפסיכיאטריה, לא רק ברפואה, הופכות להיות יותר ויותר evidence-based medicine. כך הפסיכואנליזה הלכה ואיבדה את מעמדה בתוך עולם הרפואה עד שהיא נדחקה לשוליים, מה שלטענת היסטוריונים שונים, היוותה תמריץ לשימוש ההולך וגובר בתרופות.
J'ai écrit un livre qui présentait positivement une psychanalyse, dans un livre qui s'appelle Apostille au crépuscule, et qui est une proposition de psychanalyse non freudienne. Donc s'il faut dire que nous sommes guidés par un inconscient non freudien, que cet inconscient, on peut le lire, le découvrir et savoir qu'il est déterminant chez nous, prendre en considération l'éthologie, la neuroscience, la psychanalyse existentielle de Sartre ou de Binswanger par exemple. S'il s'agit de dire que cette psychanalyse-là peut être utile et efficace, la réponse est oui. Mais simplement, il faut faire son deuil de la psychanalyse freudienne qui, elle, a fait son temps.
Freud always believed, he would say this, that someday, he always believed that someday hard science would replace the findings of psychoanalysis with chemistry and physics. And we'd find out it's all got to do with neurons and whatnot. But in the meantime, until we get to that point, psychoanalysis is a kind of stopgap. It's as close as we can get under the current state of knowledge to understanding how human beings function.
I think we live in a post-Freudian climate, and it's very hard to extract Freud if you know about his existence from that climate.
כשאני מדבר על זה שהדחקתי איזושהי חוויה, זה מושג פרוידיאני. כשאני מדבר על זה שאתה לא מוכן לדבר איתי כי אתה עכשיו משתמש במנגנון הגנה, זה מושג פרוידיאני.
That guy is so anal. That guy is so anal. Where did you get this word that somebody is so anal? What kind of a language is this? Well, everybody knows what that means. He's kamtsani, he's stingy, he's not going to let, he doesn't give up much, he's constipated in his emotions. This comes from Freudian theory.
In ordinary conversation now, people who are not any kind of psychoanalyst or Freudian still say, well, Freud would say about this. It's a code that's available to everyone.
It's a selfie. Is Freud responsible for the selfie, isn't it?
Freud n'avait peut-être pas mesuré à quel point cette libération de l'individu des chaînes qui le relient aux obligations sociales, à la morale, à la religion, etc., allait conduire à un certain narcissisme. Et effectivement, le selfie, c'est un peu la représentation de ça.
Is this a form of narcissism that's much to be regretted, or is it a way in which people use new technology for self-reflection, for a form of self-analysis, for a way of becoming introspective? I think is part of a post-Freudian legacy of an increased value of individuation.
In a sense, nobody can say how the 20th century would look different without Freud, because he colors the whole century, right? But there are many things you wouldn't have without Freud.
1,000 people in the street, singing songs and carrying signs.
כל האנשים האלה שהביאו את הפסיכואנליזה לארצות הברית, הרי להם חייבת אמריקה את הפמיניזם, את הרדיקליות, את התנועה ההיפית.
There's hardly an important figure in 20th century thought who's not been influenced by Freud. Even an anti-Freudian like Sartre is profoundly influenced by Freud by way of reaction.
עד כדי כך שכיום, כשפמיניסטית מגדפת את פרויד, היא משתמשת בשפה הפרוידיאנית.
I am only an artist who is trying to psychoanalyze psychoanalysis and Freud.
Freud is no longer a person, but a whole climate of opinion, as Auden said. Freud opened that up in a way that was like Pandora's box. You can't close it again. It's part of us now. It will be part of human thinking as long as we're around.
Bertrand Russell said in 1950, when he was asked the question for Time magazine, the greatest man of the first half of the 20th century, and Russell said, probably Einstein, but Freud and Lenin come close. Freud would have been pleased to be in this company.
And so as a historian of ideas, one studies him. We're not concerned primarily with whether he was right or wrong, but how did he change the way people thought and how did he change the way people behave? Because most of the ideas that have been influential in history are most likely false. You know, that's a fact of human history. Starting with Christianity, for example, I would say, or maybe even starting with Judaism.
Well, an interview with Freud, amongst the things he talked about were, because of the questions I put to him, were the fact that he was always associated with sex, and that this was the first of his many crimes, that he thought that human beings thought too much about sex, that they were driven too much by sex. And he said, but look at your society. Isn't this the living proof of what I said back in 1900? That was so shocking then, but is so banal now.
In the end, I succeeded in acquiring Putin
Come on.
and bringing up an international psychoanalytic association. But the struggle is not yet over. Sigmund Freud.
In a word or two, it's you I wanna do. No, not your body or mind, you fool. Give me a baby. Yeah. You sexy motherfucker. We're all alone in the villa on the Riviera. There's some friends on the south side in case you cared. Out of all your friends, I wanna be the closest. Why I tell you things that you be the most. So when it comes to life, to be this man's wife, you got to be well educated on the subject of fights. I mean prevention of, in other words, sorry, I mean the thing called love. Are you up on this? If so, then you can get up a rock and a kiss. Come here, baby, yeah. You sexy motherfucker.